It was supposed to be just another peaceful Saturday morning in the quiet suburban neighborhood. The kind of morning where sprinklers ticked rhythmically across trimmed lawns, birds sang from rooftops, and the faint aroma of brewed coffee drifted lazily from open windows. The calm was something the homeowners association liked to take credit for, though in reality most residents simply valued peace and privacy. Among them was the narrator, who owned a friendly golden retriever named Max. Max was the sort of dog that wagged his tail at every passerby, licked the hands of delivery drivers, and sprawled happily across the grass, soaking up sunlight. He was gentle, patient, and adored by children. To the community at large, Max was a source of joy. But to one particular neighbor, Max represented everything wrong with the neighborhood. That neighbor was Karen. Everyone knew her reputation. She was the type who measured the height of hedges with a ruler, scrutinized garbage bins left out a few minutes late, and scribbled furious notes to residents about imagined violations. Her wrath had once been directed at a teenager's basketball hoop, another time at someone's holiday decorations. Now, it seemed, she had found a new target: Max. The tension began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Karen would scowl from her porch whenever Max trotted past during his morning walks. She muttered under her breath as the dog sniffed around lampposts, as if his very presence disrupted her perfectly curated world. Soon she began spreading whispers about him, telling anyone who would listen that he was unpredictable, that golden retrievers were not as innocent as people thought, and that it was only a matter of time before something terrible happened. Neighbors rolled their eyes, brushing it off as another one of Karen's crusades. After all, Max had never barked aggressively, never lunged, never caused trouble. But Karen was not someone who let go of an obsession once she latched onto it. To her, every wag of Max's tail was an offense, every paw print on the sidewalk a provocation. The breaking point came on a morning much like any other. The narrator had let Max out into the front yard, where the dog happily chased a ball across the grass. Karen emerged from her house across the street, glaring as though she had discovered a crime in progress. She folded her arms, tapped her foot, and began muttering loud enough for others to hear. Her complaints escalated quickly. The dog was dangerous, he shouldn't be outside, and he was terrorizing the neighborhood. Though no one else saw it that way, Karen's performance was convincing to herself. She pulled out her phone, fingers jabbing furiously at the screen, dialing the authorities as though she were saving the neighborhood from imminent disaster. Her voice carried across the street, shrill and self-righteous, describing Max in the most menacing terms possible. A large, aggressive animal roaming unleashed, a serious threat to children, a golden beast, as she dramatically phrased it. By the time she ended the call, she stood tall, smug in her certainty that justice was on its way. She retreated to her porch, arms crossed, waiting for the police to arrive, ready to bask in her victory. Meanwhile, Max, oblivious to the storm brewing around him, plopped down on the lawn, panting happily with his ball between his paws. The only danger he posed was to the patch of grass he was flattening beneath his golden fur. But the real storm was indeed on its way. A squad car turned the corner not long after, tires crunching against the asphalt. Karen's eyes lit up as if reinforcements had finally arrived. She straightened her back, ready to point fingers and present herself as the hero of the neighborhood. The officer stepped out of the car, adjusting his belt, surveying the calm scene. Before him, a sunny street, a quiet yard, and a golden retriever wagging his tail. Karen wasted no time rushing forward, gesturing wildly at Max, insisting that the dog was dangerous, that it had been terrorizing her and others. The officer raised an eyebrow, skeptical, his gaze shifting between the calm animal and the frantic woman. Something about the mismatch between her words and reality was immediately clear. The narrator stood nearby, nervous but silent, watching as the pieces began to fall into place. The officer approached Max cautiously at first, then relaxed when the dog merely rolled onto his back, tail thumping against the grass, inviting a belly rub. The officer chuckled, a sound that only made Karen more furious. She doubled down, insisting the dog was hiding its true nature, that it had lunged at her, that it barked incessantly. But the neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the spectacle. Whispers spread, and soon multiple voices contradicted Karen's version of events. They spoke up about how Max had never harmed a soul, how he was the friendliest dog on the block, how Karen had been complaining for weeks about nonsense. One by one, the testimonies painted a different picture, not of a dangerous dog, but of a neighbor determined to cause trouble. The officer's attention shifted. His questions were no longer directed toward the narrator or Max, but toward Karen. Why had she exaggerated the situation? Why had she wasted police resources on something so trivial? Her flustered responses only made things worse. She grew louder, more defensive, lashing out at the neighbors who dared contradict her, accusing them of conspiring against her. The scene escalated from a simple complaint to a display of her own hostility. Her behavior grew erratic, her voice carrying down the block, her accusations spiraling into incoherence. What had begun as an attempt to frame a harmless golden retriever as a menace was unraveling rapidly, exposing her as the true disruption to the peace of the neighborhood. And then came the moment that no one expected. The officer, after a final attempt to calm her down, reached for his radio. His tone changed, professional and firm. Another unit was requested. Karen's eyes widened, confusion replacing her earlier confidence. She sputtered in disbelief as the realization began to dawn that she was not winning this battle. Max, still sprawled happily in the sun, seemed to sense none of the drama around him. But the neighborhood could feel the tension shifting, the tables turning. What Karen had intended as her triumph over a dog and its owner was transforming into her own undoing. The sound of a second siren in the distance sealed her fate, though she had not yet realized it. And with that, the stage was set for the confrontation that would change everything. The second police car arrived within minutes, its presence punctuating the growing tension on the street. Neighbors lingered at their fences and on their porches, curiosity pulling them closer. The usually quiet cul-de-sac now buzzed with an energy unlike anything it had seen before. Children peeked from behind their parents, whispering about the commotion, while Max, the golden retriever, continued to wag his tail, unaware that he was at the center of it all. Karen, however, was anything but unaware. Her face flushed with indignation, her posture stiff and defiant. She was still waving her arms, insisting that Max was a danger to the neighborhood, even as the officers exchanged doubtful glances. She had expected applause, validation, a moment of glory where everyone would see her as the neighborhood's protector. Instead, she found herself facing skepticism, and worse, outright opposition from her fellow residents. The second officer stepped out, calmly said, "Surveying the situation." He approached the first officer, listening as he gave a brief summary of what had transpired so far. Then his gaze shifted to Karen, who immediately launched into a frantic retelling of her fabricated story. The dog had lunged at her, she claimed. It barked viciously every night. It chased children down the street. Each accusation grew wilder than the last, painting a picture that clashed sharply with the calm golden retriever lounging on the grass. The officers allowed her to speak, their patience deliberate, their expressions neutral. Then, slowly, they began to ask questions that cut holes through her narrative. If the dog lunged at her, why did no one else see it? If the barking was constant, why had no other complaints been filed? If children were being chased, where were the parents to confirm it? Karen faltered, her confidence wavering as the questions exposed the fragility of her claims. She stammered, reaching for new excuses, redirecting blame onto the neighbors themselves. They were all against her, she said. They had always been against her. She insisted that the neighborhood was conspiring to make her look bad. It was then that several residents stepped forward, speaking clearly and calmly. They described Max's true temperament: gentle, affectionate, incapable of the aggression Karen accused him of. One neighbor recounted how Max once returned a toddler's dropped toy by carrying it carefully in his mouth. Another explained that Max often sat with her elderly father, providing comfort during lonely afternoons. The testimonies painted a vivid, undeniable portrait of a beloved family pet. The officers listened closely, their expressions firming as the truth became clearer. The more the neighbors spoke, the more Karen's version of events unraveled. What had begun as her attempt to frame Max as a threat was now exposing her as the disruptive force. Her agitation only worsened, her ice rising above the calm statements of others, until it became impossible to ignore who was truly causing the disturbance. The first officer turned back to Karen, his voice steady but firm. He explained that filing false reports was a serious matter, that wasting police resources had consequences. Karen's mouth opened and closed, disbelief flashing across her face. This was not how it was supposed to go. She had envisioned the dog being dragged away, the neighbors silenced, her authority unquestioned. Instead, the spotlight had turned harshly upon her, illuminating her pettiness for all to see. But rather than backing down, Karen escalated. Her words grew sharper, her tone more hostile. She accused the officers themselves of being negligent, of ignoring their duty. She waved her finger in their faces, shouting that they would regret not taking her seriously. The crowd shifted uneasily, murmurs spreading as the confrontation intensified. It was at this moment that Max, still blissfully unaware of the drama, padded over to one of the officers. He nudged the man's hand with his snout, tail wagging eagerly, as though asking for a simple pat. The officer obliged, chuckling softly, and the sight drew smiles from several neighbors. The contrast was undeniable, a gentle dog spreading warmth, and a furious neighbor radiating hostility. The officers exchanged a final glance, and something unspoken passed between them. Their decision was made. One of them informed Karen that her behavior was crossing into disorderly conduct, that she was causing a public disturbance. The words seemed to strike her like a physical blow. She gasped, pointing wildly at Max again, as if repeating her accusations would somehow rewrite the reality everyone could plainly see. But the murmurs from the crowd grew louder, no longer sympathetic. Residents shook their heads, some openly laughing at the absurdity of her outburst. The illusion of authority she had tried so desperately to project had crumbled. She was no longer the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood. She was the spectacle, the problem, the one everyone wished would simply calm down. Karen's face hardened, her pride refusing to yield. She shouted louder, her words spilling into incoherent rants about neighborhood rules, about ungrateful neighbors, about conspiracies no one else could see. And with each word, she edged herself closer to the point of no return. The officers began moving toward her, their intentions clear. The neighbors leaned in, their anticipation growing, sensing what was about to happen. And through it all, Max simply sat down in the grass once more, tilting his head at the chaos unfolding before him, as if quietly wondering why humans made life so complicated. The situation was no longer about him, it was about Karen, her lies, and the consequences of her actions. The officers were ready to act, and when they did, the neighborhood would never forget it. The air grew heavier as the officers approached Karen, their movements measured and deliberate. The neighborhood, now fully gathered, held its collective breath. What had started as a petty complaint about a golden retriever had transformed into something far greater, a confrontation between authority and the one person who had long thrived on controlling others through intimidation. Karen stood her ground, her arms flailing as she continued her tirade. Her words had lost all coherence, spilling into accusations that made little sense. She blamed the dog, the neighbors, the homeowners association, and now the police themselves. Her voice carried across the block, shrill and insistent, but it no longer commanded attention. Instead, it revealed her desperation, her inability to stop once her pride was on the line. The first officer held up his hand, attempting one final time to de-escalate the situation. He warned her clearly that if she did not calm down, consequences would follow. But Karen was past the point of reason. She refused to listen, refusing to surrender the illusion of authority she had clung to for so long. Her shouting only grew louder, her finger jabbing at the officer's chest in a gesture that crossed the final boundary. That was the moment the shift occurred. In one smooth motion, the officer signaled to his partner. Hands reached for her arms, firm but controlled. Karen gasped in disbelief, twisting as though the world itself had betrayed her. The neighbors looked on, eyes widening, murmurs rippling through the crowd. No one had truly expected it to come to this, yet no one was surprised either. The officers informed her that she was being detained for disorderly conduct and for filing a false report. The words cut through the air, final and indisputable. Karen's face drained of color, her confidence collapsing into outrage. She demanded to know how they could dare treat her this way, how they could ignore the real problem sitting quietly on the grass. But her protests were drowned out by the click of handcuffs fastening around her wrists. The sound echoed across the street, louder than her screams, louder than the murmurs of the neighbors. It was the sound of consequences finally arriving after years of unchecked behavior. For the first time, Karen was not in control. She was not the one giving orders or dictating rules. She was the subject of scrutiny, the person everyone else was watching with a mix of disbelief and satisfaction. As the officers guided her toward the police car, her resistance only fueled the spectacle. She twisted, she shouted, she demanded that someone intervene. But no one stepped forward to defend her. Not a single neighbor spoke up on her behalf. Instead, the crowd stood still, some with folded arms, some shaking their heads, others recording quietly with their phones. It was the silent judgment of a community long exhausted by their antics. Meanwhile, Max trotted toward the edge of the yard, tail wagging gently, as though he sensed the shift in energy. He barked once, softly, playfully, as if marking the end of the drama he had unwittingly sparked. The irony was undeniable. The so-called dangerous animal was calm, composed, even joyful, while the person who had accused him of menace was the one being restrained and taken away. Karen's voice cracked as she was placed into the back of the squad car. Her threats grew weaker, her words tinged with disbelief. She insisted this was a mistake, that it would all be corrected once the truth came out. But the truth was already clear, laid bare for the entire neighborhood to see. The officers closed the door with a firm thud. The sound silenced the street, leaving behind only the distant hum of cicadas and the occasional bark of Max, still eager for someone to throw his ball again. For a moment, no one moved. The surreal image of Karen in the back of a police car was almost too much to process. This was the woman who had terrorized them with endless complaints, who had called the HOA on the smallest of matters, who had carried herself as though she alone upheld the rules of the neighborhood. Now she sat powerless, her voice muffled behind glass. Her reign abruptly ended. The officers addressed the neighbors briefly, thanking them for their cooperation and assuring them that the situation was under control. They explained that Karen would be taken in for processing, that her actions would be reviewed, and that she could potentially face charges. The words carried a finality that settled over the crowd like a curtain falling at the end of a long, exhausting play. One by one, the neighbors began to disperse. Conversations erupted in hushed tones, disbelief giving way to laughter, to relief, to the shared realization that the neighborhood had finally been freed from Karen's relentless interference. Parents smile. As they gathered their children, some whispering that perhaps now the block would truly be peaceful. Others simply shook their heads, still marveling at the spectacle they had witnessed. The narrator stood quietly, Max leaning gently against their leg. They watched as the squad car pulled away, Karen's silhouette still visible in the back seat, her face pressed against the window in a mix of fury and despair. The irony was inescapable. She had summoned the police to rid the neighborhood of a dog, and instead, the police had rid the neighborhood of her. But the story was far from over. The arrest was not the end, only the beginning. The HOA would become involved, reports would be filed, and the community would have to decide what came next. Karen was not the type to let go easily, and the narrator knew deep down that this was only the start of a much larger conflict. The golden retriever, however, knew nothing of these looming battles. Max simply looked up with bright eyes, tail wagging, as if asking when the ball would be thrown again. The narrator gave it a toss, watching Max bound happily across the lawn. For a brief moment, peace returned to the street. But in the distance, the echo of Karen's fury still lingered. A storm waiting to return. The morning after Karen's arrest dawned strangely quiet. For the first time in years, the block was free of her surveillance, her constant commentary, her endless complaints. Lawns glistened with dew, sprinklers arced in perfect rhythm, and Max bounded happily across the yard, blissfully unaware of the seismic shift that had taken place the day before. But though the street looked peaceful, conversations simmered beneath the surface. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact for fear of becoming Karen's next target now leaned across fences, chatting freely. Small clusters formed on driveways and sidewalks, united by the share. The memory of watching her hauled away in handcuffs. Some retold the story with disbelief, others with amusement, but all of them with a sense of relief. The Homeowners Association, however, was not amused. By mid-morning, an emergency meeting was called. The board gathered in the clubhouse at the end of the street, papers spread across a long table, voices hushed with both curiosity and concern. Karen's name had appeared in countless reports over the years, but this time was different. An arrest was something none of them could ignore. Word spread quickly that the HOA board was drafting a formal statement. Some residents hoped it would finally be the end of Karen's influence, while others worried she might somehow twist the situation into an attack against her. After all, she had a history of turning even the smallest slight into an elaborate crusade. Meanwhile, the narrator went about their day with Max at their side. Trips to the mailbox, a walk down the street, even a simple game of fetch, all were met with waves, smiles, and supportive words from neighbors. People stopped to pet Max, to reassure his owner that no one believed Karen's accusations. The golden retriever had gone from being the target of her hostility to the unlikely hero of the neighborhood. But beneath the relief, there was unease. Everyone knew Karen too well to believe she would simply disappear. She was not the type to accept defeat, not even when confronted with undeniable consequences. And indeed, as the day wore on, hints of her return began to appear. First came the whispers that she had been released later that evening. Then came the sight of her car parked once again in her driveway, its presence like a shadow looming over the block. By nightfall, lights glowed in her windows, and the faint sound of her voice carried into the street, still loud, still sharp, still filled with the same righteous indignation as before. The next morning, an email circulated through the neighborhood mailing list. Written in Karen's familiar dramatic tone, it accused the residents of betrayal, of conspiring against her, of humiliating her in front of strangers. She insisted the arrest had been a mistake, that she was the true victim, and that she would not rest until her name was cleared. Her words dripped with venom, yet they also revealed her desperation. The community's response was immediate. Instead of rallying to her side as she had hoped, neighbors dismissed her claims with exasperation. Many replied to the thread with firm rebuttals, pointing out her long history of harassment, her constant meddling, and the absurdity of her accusations. For the first time, her voice was drowned out not by silence, but by collective resistance. The HOA board released their official statement shortly after. It confirmed that Karen's behavior was under review, that her conduct had violated multiple community guidelines, and that disciplinary measures, including possible fines and restrictions, were being considered. The words were measured, careful, but they carried the weight of authority that even Karen could not easily dismiss. Her reaction, however, was predictable. By the afternoon, she was on her porch, phone pressed to her ear, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. She claimed to be contacting lawyers, journalists, even government officials. She warned that lawsuits were coming, that the neighborhood would regret ever crossing her. But her threats no longer carried the same fear they once did. Instead, they sounded hollow, desperate, almost pathetic. Max, meanwhile, became the quiet symbol of defiance against her chaos. Children came to play with him more often. Parents lingered longer on the sidewalks. Neighbors gathered to toss him a ball or scratch behind his ears. Where Karen had once divided the community, Max now seemed to unite it. His calm presence, his golden fur shining in the sun, reminded everyone what normal life in the neighborhood could feel like. Still, tension lingered. No one knew what Karen's next move would be. She had been humiliated publicly, stripped of the control she once wielded, but she was not defeated. Those who had lived under her scrutiny for years knew that this was not the end. It was only the beginning of her retaliation. Late one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and porch lights flickered on across the street, the narrator spotted Karen standing at her window. Her silhouette loomed against the glow of the lamp behind her, her gaze fixed on the yard where Max lay asleep. Even from a distance, her posture was unmistakable. Rigid, watchful, seething. She had lost the battle, yes, but the war, at least in her mind, was far from over. And the neighborhood was about to discover just how far Karen was willing to go to claw back the control she believed was hers. The following week carried with it an uneasy tension, the kind that lingered in the air even when everything seemed normal on the surface. On the outside, the neighborhood looked peaceful, lawns trimmed, cars washed, children laughing as they biked up and down the cul-de-sac. But behind the smiles and friendly waves, everyone knew Karen was plotting her next move. Her silence didn't last long. By midweek, the first signs appeared. A letter slipped into mailboxes, typed in bold, capital letters, demanding that residents take seriously the threat of uncontrolled animals. Though she did not sign her name, no one doubted who the author was. The letter accused the neighborhood of ignoring safety, of conspiring to silence her, and of endangering children. It ended with a thinly veiled warning. If the HOA won't enforce order, I will. The neighbors chuckled at first, dismissing the letter as yet another of Karen's rants, but her persistence soon made it harder to ignore. More letters followed, longer, more dramatic, stapled to community bulletin boards and slipped under doors. She peered them with exaggerated statistics about dog attacks, with quotes ripped from obscure articles, and with accusations against anyone who dared defend Max. Then came the complaints. She began filing reports with the HOA at a relentless pace, accusing Max's owner of every violation imaginable. Trash bins left out a few minutes late, a patch of grass slightly overgrown, even the color of the curtains visible from the street. Each became a new item in her arsenal. Her obsession with the dog had spilled into an all-out campaign against the household that sheltered him. The HOA, already exhausted by her antics, attempted to dismiss the reports, but Karen's persistence wore thin on the board. Meetings stretched longer, paperwork piled higher, and the once manageable duties of the association became tangled in her endless stream of grievances. Some members openly expressed their frustration, but Karen thrived on the attention, no matter how negative. Her behavior extended beyond paperwork. She patrolled the street with renewed intensity, walking briskly with a clipboard in hand, scribbling notes about her neighbors' homes. She stopped in front of the narrator's yard often, glaring at Max as though her gaze alone could prove his supposed danger. When children came to play with him, she snapped photos from across the street, muttering about evidence. Parents grew uneasy, whispering about whether her obsession was crossing into harassment. One afternoon, a new escalation emerged. Animal control arrived in the neighborhood, responding to yet another anonymous complaint about a dangerous golden retriever. The officer who arrived was polite but weary, clearly recognizing the pattern. Max greeted him with the same gentle wag of his tail, and within minutes, the officer confirmed there was no issue. But the visit itself rattled the neighbors. If Karen was willing to weaponize very authority she could, how far would she go? Her obsession began to isolate her further. Where once people tolerated her, now they openly avoided her. Invitations were no longer extended. Conversations ceased when she approached, and gatherings shifted to backyards where she couldn't intrude. But isolation only deepened her resentment. She doubled down, pacing her porch at odd hours, typing furiously on her laptop, sending what seemed like endless streams of emails. For the narrator, life became a balance between frustration and determination. Each day brought a new complaint, a new trick, a new attempt by Karen to prove her superiority. Yet each day also brought reassurance from the neighborhood, from the smiles of children who played with Max, from the quiet solidarity of neighbors who had grown tired of her reign of intimidation. Still, the sense of unease lingered. Karen was not merely annoying, she was escalating. Her letters grew sharper, her behavior more erratic. Late at night, lights flickered in her windows as she stayed up typing, her silhouette pacing angrily against the blinds. And then came the incident that shifted everything once more. Late one evening, the narrator stepped outside to bring Max in from the yard. The golden retriever was sniffing contentedly at the grass when a sudden movement caught the corner of their eye. Across the street, Karen stood at the edge of her lawn, holding her phone high, recording every second. Her voice, faint but sharp, carried across the street. Accusations about trespassing, about noise, about imagined threats. Max lifted his head, ears perked, then trotted back toward his owner, tail wagging as if nothing were wrong. But the unease grew heavier. Karen wasn't just filing complaints anymore. She was documenting, archiving, building some twisted case that existed only in her mind. The neighbors saw it too. Curtains shifted, blinds cracked open, and whispers spread the next morning about her prowling the street after dark, muttering to herself, clutching her phone like a weapon. The HOA board convened again, and this time with sharper words. Enough was enough. Karen's behavior had crossed the line from nuisance into harassment, and action needed to be taken. But as plans were discussed and warnings drafted, no one could predict how Karen would respond once confronted again. Because Karen was not someone who backed down. She was someone who escalated until she was forced to stop. And soon, the neighborhood would find out just how far she was willing to push. By the time summer settled over the neighborhood, Karen's crusade had consumed every ounce of her energy. What had begun with a phone call about a golden retriever had spiraled into a storm of accusations, late-night rants, and relentless harassment. The community had grown weary. Parents no longer hushed their children when she passed. Neighbors no longer lowered their voices. Instead, they stood taller, united in their frustration, unwilling to be bullied any longer. The HOA board had reached its breaking point. After weeks of complaints, midnight patrols, and threats of lawsuits that never materialized, they prepared a final notice. Karen was to attend a disciplinary hearing, one that would decide whether fines, restrictions, or even removal from the community would be pursued. For years, she had wielded the HOA as her personal weapon. Now it was turning against her. The notice was delivered quietly, slipped into her mailbox one morning. By noon, Karen was on her porch, waving the paper as though it were proof of her victimhood. Her voice carried down the street, full of fury and indignation. She shouted about conspiracies, about persecution, about how the neighborhood was blind to the real threat that still sat happily in the grass across the street. Her words fell flat. The neighbors, once cowed into silence, now met her outbursts with cold stares or turned backs. She was alone. But Karen was not finished. On the day of the hearing, she arrived with binders stacked high, filled with photos of Max, printouts of exaggerated articles, and pages of handwritten notes. She stormed into the clubhouse, her presence loud and demanding, her eyes wild with the certainty that she could bend reality to her will. The board sat patiently, listening as she launched into her rehearsed tirade. She spoke of danger, of negligence, of betrayal. She accused the neighbors of conspiring against her, of falsifying their testimonies, of endangering children. She slammed photos onto the table, images of Max sniffing grass, lying in the sun, playing with children. To her, they were evidence of menace. To everyone else, they were proof of her obsession. One by one, the board members asked their questions. Why had no one else ever filed similar complaints? Why did the supposed dangerous dog have such a spotless record with animal control? Why did her accounts contradict those of every single other neighbor on the block? Karen grew flustered, her voice cracking as she tried to twist each question into another accusation. She insisted the board was corrupt, that the neighbors were liars, that she was the only one brave enough to speak the truth. Her words, once sharp and commanding, now rang hollow, brittle under the weight of scrutiny. Then came the moment that sealed her fate. One board member produced a stack of counter-complaints filed by neighbors, statements about her harassment, her threats, her constant disruptions. They spoke of her standing outside homes at night, of her photographing children without permission, of her endless stream of baseless accusations. The pattern was undeniable. For the first time, Karen faltered. Her eyes darted across the room, searching for an ally, a sympathetic face, someone who would nod in agreement. But she found none. The very community she had tried to control now stood united against her. The decision was swift. Karen was fined heavily for her false reports, placed under strict restrictions by the HOA, and warned that further harassment would lead to legal action, including possible removal from the neighborhood. The gavel fell, and with it, the last of her authority crumbled. She stormed out of the clubhouse, binders clutched to her chest, her face flushed with humiliation. The neighbors watched silently as she marched back to her house, her footsteps sharp against the pavement. There were no cheers, no taunts, just the quiet satisfaction of justice finally delivered. In the days that followed, Karen's presence faded. Her rants grew shorter, her patrols less frequent. Curtains stayed drawn across her windows, and her porch sat empty. The letters stopped, the emails dwindled, the phone calls ceased. She had not given up. Karen never truly gave up. But she had been silenced, stripped of the power she once wielded so recklessly. And through it all, Max remained unchanged. He still bounded joyfully across the yard, still greeted children with wagging tail, still lay in the sun with the same calm contentment as before. The golden retriever had outlasted her wrath, had become the quiet symbol of resistance, the proof that truth always outshines hysteria. The neighborhood, at last, found peace. Fences no longer felt like barriers, but boundaries of respect. Gatherings filled with laughter instead of whispers. And as summer evenings stretched into night, the faint sound of children playing with Max replaced the shrill echoes of Karen's voice. For the narrator, the ordeal became a reminder of resilience, that no matter how loud or persistent the falsehood, it could never withstand the steady strength of truth and community. Karen had tried to cast a shadow, but in the end, she had only revealed the light of what lay beyond her control. As for Karen, she remained in her house, a ghost of the force she once was. Neighbors spoke of her less and less, until her name became little more than a memory of conflict past. She had seed, but out to destroy the peace of the neighborhood and had instead destroyed her own standing within it. And Max, the so-called dangerous animal, simply wagged his tail, happy to live in a world where he